Hi, everyone. I am Sean Markin with WeTHRV, and I have the absolute privilege of bringing you Kavita Ajmere. She is a psychotherapist and just one of the most amazing people I've ever met. She's built a thriving practice, and she's going to help us, and you're going to get a lot out of it. So, Kavita, before I screw up anything more on your introduction, I'll let you sort of give your background.
Sure. Thank you for that. I am a psychologist. I have a PhD, and I've been practicing for almost 25 years, licensed in Illinois and in California, and also multiple states, which has been a blessing for me because people can see me virtually and I can see them. And so there are no shortages of being able to ask for help. So that's been a really unique aspect of therapy and how it's shifted post-pandemic or pandemic-y.
Yeah, people have been moving around since the pandemic. And you and I have the same, we share, well, we're both from Chicago, and we both share desperate love of Chicago pizza. So there's that.
There's that.
Beyond pizza therapy, how do you think about the therapeutic relationship with your clients?
Right. So I think the therapeutic alliance is so vital. So can your client trust you? Are they willing to go on this journey with you? Because the journey is not always easy. It's not always rainbows and unicorns, but there's times where it can be frustrating. What I think is really important is that clients know that she's going to be there. She's dependable. It may not always move seamlessly, but I know that she's going to be there to help me. So being able to know that is, I think that there are things that every client wants, right? It's to feel safe, to be able to be seen, to feel like who they're talking to is a secure person. And can that person help me find ways to soothe myself? I may not be able to soothe the client, but that's not my goal. My goal is to help them figure out ways in which they can soothe themselves.
I think that's such a powerful thing because I have met people who seem a little disordered. It's almost always one of the things that comes out later in my friendship or relationship with them is that they lack self-soothing, self-coping skills. I also love that you called it an alliance. I sort of framed it as a relationship, and I think an alliance is such a powerful way of framing that relationship. It really makes it more concrete for me.
Right. And I think that the alliance piece is so big. It's saying, I am your ally in this, right? You don't have to stand alone.
And I think when you think about helping your clients, it probably come to you feeling quite alone. Is that usually the case?
There are so many different tentacles to the alone part. Let's take, for example, a lot of my clientele, which is working with Indian female doctors who are physicians, where they oftentimes can feel alone in marginalized ways, whether it's, are they misunderstood in their work setting? Are there aspects of gender that come up, or microaggressions, or sometimes macroaggressions that come up in their day-to-day work? And then all of the demands of who they are and the cultural expectations of being an Indian female, and then living in a different world. So they've got one foot in two different cultures, and sometimes one culture is more demanding than the other, and neither culture necessarily lets up.
That's such a powerful focus you have, because it seems like that population has such unique needs. Maybe you could talk about that. Like, what are their unique needs, and how if I'm, not that I am, although maybe I aspire to be a female Indian MD at some point in my career when I grow up. What are my faith and how are you sort of helping me?
So I think just even understanding some of the family of origin challenges, right? So kind of early on growing up, for many of them, being a physician wasn't necessarily a choice. It was an expectation, whether it was their family of origin that they grew up in, both parents were physicians, or maybe one parent was a physician, or even in their extended family. You can go back a generation or two. And when Indian folks started immigrating here in the 70s, most of them that were immigrating here were physicians. And so, now it's this kind of first generation Indian females that are living here now, second generation. But the expectation was, we came here to give you a better life, and we were physicians in India, and we have the same expectations for you. And I think when you are growing up in a completely different world in which your parents grew up in, you come from a relatively traditional Indian background, and then you're hoisted into a world that is so different. Not only are the rules different, but the people look different from you. I have heard so many stories of just growing up with some blatant racism and what that was like. And blatant, even around gender, the experiences that they had around gender. So I think when you look at the intersectionality of how some of these women were marginalized within their family and the greater culture that they're living in, and also in terms of gender and gender roles and expectations, it's a lot to carry. That's not even going to med school or finding a residency or establishing yourself as a physician. That's just the backstory of all the things that came before they had to, endure more. So I think for some people, it's little t, there's some trauma in there. And for some people, it's like big T. Big T being that no matter what, these were the expectations. And it didn't matter if you didn't sleep. And it didn't matter if you were studying until 3:00 in the morning just to get those grades too. So, I think that all of those aspects of the self are with us. We don't lose those. But how have they served us or not served us? As these women are getting older, what is the life that they want to create versus the life that they had to endure in, right? So how do I help you move from surviving to thriving?
I love that. Do you find that in your work with these women that there is jumping off point or maybe like a trigger or something where they're like, I got to start living for myself, or maybe like there's something that allows them to sort of realize that I haven't been living for myself at some point? Is there like something that like common for them?
I don't know that it's any one thing, but I think there are so many different aspects that can really question, am I living my authentic life and who am I living this life for? So when it comes time for mate selection, let's say, right, you are an Indian physician, female living in the U.S., what are the expectations around mate selection? Are the expectations that you are to find, you are to be within the heterosexual confines? You have to marry a man and you have to marry an Indian man. And so, what are those challenges? I think mate selection historically for Indian women is a challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where there's an expectation there and that they have to abide by those expectations.
Regardless of what they want for themselves.
Regardless of what they want. I think that is slowly starting to shift. But I certainly see within my generation and the folks that are in their 50s and even a little bit younger in their 40s, that there is still a fair amount of pressure and there are some cultural expectations.
How do you help them navigate that? Because it seems like a powerfully crushing force, but also like an uplifting one in some ways. So it's sort of, like you've got a strong family, you've got people that support you and love you, and on some level, hopefully they're putting this pressure because they believe that it's what you need. And so there's this element of support, but also like you're not in some ways getting to choose your own life. So how do you help them navigate that?
I will say that it's not always easy. And I think part of it is really understanding their narrative, helping them live in alignment to themselves. But part of that is also being able to communicate effectively and respectfully, their needs versus their parents' needs, and to truly have a dialogue. In the Indian culture, there's always a lot of debates and there's not enough dialogue.
Okay.
So kind of moving that narrative of like, so if we could have this conversation with your parents or your family or your mother or whoever, like, let's really talk about how we can even work effectively and communicate. So, it's not uncommon that I will have a session with my client and a collateral person in their family, whether it's their father, mother, or both, just can really hear each other.
How does that go? I got to imagine that is, and maybe this is a stereotype of people from an older generation, but I got to imagine that therapy isn't their first. For people I've known, it's foreign. It's a foreign concept, and it feels to some people like a loss or like something's broken as opposed to a positive. Is that your experience with, bringing these collateral people in, or is it easier than I'm expecting?
I definitely think that there is an element of like, why would I talk to somebody that I don't know? What is this person going to tell me that I don't already know? And so my conversation is usually like, I just want to invite you to think about another perspective.
If I were to guess, based on what I know about you, it seems like you would be expert level at getting someone who starts with a bit of resistance, warm up and start to listen, and then ultimately sort of be able to participate in their child's growth.
Right. I think in many cultures, but certainly in Indian culture, things are either black or white, right? It's yes or no. And so for a lot of my work is, how can we hold the both and, right? How can you love your daughter at the same time and not want her to marry someone who is not Indian, let's just say, right? So how can you hold both of those aspects? And so both things are true, maybe for you, possibly.
Some people have their sort of, let's just call it their awakening or their moment where they're sort of wanting to take ownership of their life. But once they've already gotten into a relationship, that seems very complex because now you have at least another person, potentially children involved. For Indian female doctors, how are they thinking about that? How do they build up the strength to sort of confront what at that point seems very scary, probably? How should they be thinking about that?
I think so much of that work is really tough because it's a lot of that relational self-awareness piece of like, who am I as a person? Who do I want to be? What do I think I deserve? Right. So asking those complex questions, but then also getting to the nitty-gritty parts of it, right? What would you want for your child? Right. And looking at the dichotomy of, well, why is that different for you? So some of it is doing some inner child work.
And it's got to be a real act of bravery to sort of take those first steps before they speak to you or before they're reaching out to you, because it's scary. I don't have much exposure to this population, but I know a lot of my friends who were resistant to therapy but then ultimately got into it. They were scared because they had this sense that their entire life was going to be upended. And not in a way that they necessarily could control. And so I've got to imagine that when you add on the cultural pressure, the marriage that they might already have, the kids that they have, it's got to be really scary. And so
I think it is scary. I mean, I think taking the first step is very scary because there's like this unknown aspect, right? And then when we start talking, there's that moment of, oh, wow, all of this stuff is very real. And I think it takes a brave person to deal with real things. It's a lot easier to not engage in the therapeutic process, to be honest with you.
It's interesting because it's one of those things where it's like the boiling frog, and I love animals, so I hate that analogy, but like, it's much easier to deal with a terrible life 1 minute at a time versus getting out of that situation and being, instantaneously cold or whatever a good analogy for that would be. How do you have that first initial conversation in a way that it's easier for them? Because like you said, it's scary. But I imagine that initial sort of conversation is, I just know you. And so I know that you have an easy way of making that feel non-threatening, or at least a lot less threatening, so that when they sit down there and they're talking to you, it doesn't feel as bad as they sort of probably built it up in their head on the drive over to your office.
So I think the first thing is just to acknowledge and validate the bravery in taking that first step. And also saying like, how wonderful that you made this decision to take care of yourself. You spend whatever, 10, 12-hour days taking care of other people. And,
Probably more if you're a surgeon or
right? And probably more. Like how wonderful that you took the time to put your own emergency mask on first.
How do you then sort of transition them or prepare them for, because there is this period when you get into therapy where, like you said, it becomes real and it almost feels like you're taking steps backwards or things are getting harder. You're starting to, you have shut down a lot of your emotional life, a lot of your feelings to basically be able to have the life that you currently have. And now you start to feel new things. That is its own level of scary, and the uncertainty is one thing, and now feeling these things are scary. And this is such a unique situation where you're dealing with that relationship and maybe you have your job or your job isn't going okay. You've got that one thing you need to focus on. This is a person who's at the intersection, as you said, of a lot of shit. You've got them you've got the relationship with their parents, the relationship with their kids, the relationship with their job, which is unrelenting and difficult, and their relationship with their significant other. How do you help with that transition?
I think so much of that transition is being able to understand, when are you feeling regulated, right? And because what you're experiencing right now can be really dysregulating. So kind of really focusing on moments of when they feel regulated, and if they don't know how to regulate, part of my job is to introduce regulatory strategies. What's regulation to one person is not. It may be very different for another person, right? Some physicians will say, I will go to my weekly yoga class, or I don't miss yoga, and that really helps me reset my nervous system. Great, that's wonderful. Or for other people, it might be going to pray, or making sure that they see friends regularly. But it's kind of really helping folks. How are you regulating your nervous system? Are you sleeping well? What are your social connections like? Are you exercising, right? Are you eating well? Yeah, I have work with physicians, and so some of them were like, I didn't eat all day long. And I'm like, well, let's change that.
It seems so small, and yet it's so huge. It's so huge to sort of get in, at least for me, not that I'm a physician, but I notice when I'm sort of being intentional about my diet, even though I'm generally healthy, it is a night and day difference in terms of my sort of outlook on the world. I imagine you're also giving them, as a physician, for example, let's just say you're a surgeon, you get a call from your kids and they're sick and they need to be picked up from school or something like that. There's probably techniques you give them in the moment, right? Because, okay, you can schedule yoga, you can schedule your diet and all those things are things, but there's probably the in the moment trauma or the in the moment triggers that they need help with, I would imagine.
There are things that, yes, in that very moment, kind of let's slow down, right? Let's engage in some ways to help you regulate in the moment, whether it's taking deep breaths until you go and pick up your child from school or whatever, or coming up with contingency plans, right? Who else can be helpful in this? You don't have to do it all. And really helping the individual come up with methods and strategies in ways that feel aligned with them, right? It's I'll have some Indian physicians will say, I would never hire a nanny. Okay. Do you trust anyone in your family? Yes, I trust my mom. No. Is that going to be someone who can kind of help raise your children?
That's so powerful. What should someone who's interested in working with you, how should they think about getting started? Some of it building up the courage. What should they do to prepare for, working with you?
So I think being able to ask some reflective questions, right? How am I feeling right now? How do I want to feel? I think that knowing how you're feeling and knowing how you want to feel when there's this disparity, that usually is a pretty good indication of, what, I would benefit from talking to someone. Do I feel like I'm living in alignment, right? Do my values fit my day-to-day, right? I might really value social connectedness, but if I'm not engaging in any social connectedness, we've got a pretty big disparity there, right? So it's kind of how are you living in attunement? And if you're not, let's find ways that you can.
One of the things that I know I have personally struggled with and some of my friends have struggled with is kind of knowing to some extent those values. You labeled them values. I don't know that that's how I would understand them for myself, but it took a while for me to sort of, and this is going to sound insane, it took a while for me to sort of realize that like, oh, I'm a social being. I didn't even ask that question. I'll talk to somebody at, the grocery store or something like that. And I'm done with that conversation in the car and I'm measurably happier. And I'm like, oh, I forgot I'm an extrovert. Okay. So I imagine that I can't be a unique flower. Do you find that some of your patients you actually have to help, like they're kind of like going into it a little blind to some extent, or they're like kind of like, they're just feeling there's something off. They're not really sure. They can't put a finger on it. Like, and you sort of actually have to give them the labels or help them see what those labels are. Like you would help me see, oh, you do actually like being around people and talking to people, and you actually feel better when you do that.
I am so glad that you said that, because what comes up for me is, yes, people might not even know what their values are, right? So it's kind of spending time doing a values assessment even. Like, let's take a look and let's assess what your values are. If we don't know, let's come up with, a self-mission statement for who you want to be.
I think that's super powerful. It would seem to me like if I'm an Indian female physician, even if I couldn't label like what I didn't want, if I just had the sense that, okay, something isn't right, maybe I should have a conversation and see where it goes. That's a powerful enough motivator to sort of see. Because I think successful people oftentimes have had to silence a lot of that. So there's not any glaring red flags where you're like, I'm not doing this, or this part of my life is like totally broken. It's more like, I just feel off, and maybe it would help to talk to someone, or maybe it wouldn't. I don't really know, but let me at least take that option for myself. Give myself that.
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes people don't recognize how they're talking to themselves, right? So sometimes I will ask somebody, if I were to broadcast your thoughts out loud, let's say at a stadium, who is speaking? Is it your inner critic or is it your inner advocate?
I won't tell you the answer for me, but yeah, that's a great question. My tennis coach,
right,
has been a wonderful therapist for me.
Well, that's wonderful. That's good. Coaches are really therapeutic. I don't underestimate them.
We're very focused on the positive things that I do. Speaking of positive things, you've built a very thriving practice. Sort of switching gears a little bit, other therapists would love to sort of replicate your strategy. And I know that you have recently spoken to the California Association of Marriage and Family Clinicians. That's such an honor. Not everybody gets that. How, besides being awesome, which is a given, how would a therapist go about getting that? How did you sort of build that?
Well, thank you for the accolades. So
there's more to come. Don't worry.
I do feel like there's a lot of power in networking, right? So a colleague of mine said, you should reach out to another colleague who is in Northern California. That colleague said, you know what? Your expertise in doing cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy sounds great. And our association, our CAMFT, California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, the Marin chapter is looking for a speaker. Would you be interested in speaking on that? And so the opportunity presented itself, and I was lucky enough to do that.
Fantastic. You are also very trusted amongst other therapists, and they are sort of relying, sending you clients. And that's a way that you've been growing your practice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How are you building those relationships? Is there a roadmap? Do I call other therapists? What's your strategy?
I have done all kinds of things. I have cold called and said, can we meet for lunch? And kind of gone from there. And genuinely, I personally think, maybe a little bit biased, but therapists are genuinely warm, kind people. And so these are people that I want to get to know. They're not just like, oh, let me go have lunch with them once, or Very rarely has it been a one-off. More often than not, that these are people that not only are who I've come to grow, learn, and trust, but these are people who are in my professional Rolodex and some who are now in my personal Rolodex as well.
And you've done a lot of work with kids as well through your work at Harvard Westlake. Tell me more about that. That's got to be really interesting.
So I worked at a few independent schools at Francis Parker in Chicago, Harvard Westlake, Curtis School, which is an elementary school, and then most recently Oakwood School in Los Angeles, except for Chicago at Francis Parker. I started my therapeutic journey and figuring out where were my tender spots growing up. And my tender spots were really around those adolescent years.
Interesting.
And so initially when I started my therapeutic career, I really focused on young adults. And I still do. I still enjoy it. And so what I like about working with that particular population is it's very similar to working with Indian doctors in some ways, right? Like there's this immense amount of pressure to achieve.
Especially at like a Harvard Westlake or...
Right? There's this immense amount of pressure to achieve. Many of them come from culturally non-mainstream cultural backgrounds, let's say. I think I've always kind of understood that child and that child's cultural experience to a large degree. I also feel that at times they are incredibly rewarding human beings to work with.
As someone who founded a school, I can speak to that. I can agree with you. Although it wasn't high school, it was a grade school. First graders are the world's greatest invention.
I mean, first graders...
That's my understanding about it. They're the world's greatest invention.
Right. I mean, here's the thing about when you work in a school, all the excitement that the minute you walk on campus, there is a lot of excitement.
Can I tell you a little anecdote from me starting the school?
Sure. I would love to hear it.
We were the Almafuerte Eagles. And,
say that again?
The Almafuerte, which means strong soul in Spanish, Eagles. I made the logo, came up with the name, all these things. And one of our academic lead at the time was like, you know what would be cool? And I'm like, tell me. On the first day, dress up in this eagle costume and welcome the kids. And I was like, that's the greatest idea I've ever heard. I'm in. She got this eagle costume. So I show up in this eagle costume, and I'm like waving traffic in on the first day. Well, what it turns out to be is that little kids don't know what an eagle is, but they do know what a chicken is. So the entire year I was the chicken. And so
my gosh, that's funny.
Yeah, so they'd come up to me and be like, chicken butt. And then all of a sudden you become the brunt of these jokes because, like kids are really good at giving awful nicknames like chicken butt. And the way I would bribe them, like if I needed them to do something, like if they want to get my attention, they need they'd be like, chicken. And I'd be like, I don't know what a chicken is. I don't see a chicken yet. They'd be like, for an eagle. It was the greatest things. Kid validation is the greatest, one of the most powerful forces in the universe.
It is so powerful, and it's powerful for adults too.
Oh, they're so adorable. They would the teachers would send me these videos of them like asking for me. I was like, oh, and then I would walk into first grade. I had to be very cautious about walking into first grade because it was so disruptive. Because I would actually like play soccer with them and all these other things. Because once I did the hard work of founding the school, I was basically the board chair. So I could just relax in and like try to make sure things worked and we were continuing to advance. And our mission was basically every child would graduate basically 8th grade having founded a business. The focus was entrepreneurship.
That's amazing.
Thank you. And so like at that point I could just be like the cool uncle, which is like a role I fall into naturally. And so I would walk into first grade and they would just like, everybody would get out of their seat and I would be bum rushed. And it's the only experience of feeling like a rock star that I've ever had. But it was like basically all you need. It was fantastic.
That is amazing.
I imagined that my experience with honors kids, especially in high school, specifically Indian honors kids and then the females that I knew, that I would imagine where a lot of the I don't want to call it trauma because I think that there's a lot of pluses and minuses, but that's where a lot of the conflict that later hits, say, Indian female doctors originates. And it's not surprising to me that's where you said your tender spots are.
Yeah. So that's what I was. Pardon?
Is that a period of their life where you delve into with your clients?
Undoubtedly, right? So whether for those tender spots were big trauma, big T, or they were little T, little trauma, I don't know. I think that just depends on the individual. But there's definitely some tender spots around there. There's some pain points for many of them.
As we sort of, end this, what should a physician, a female Indian physician, if she's considering speaking with you, how does she prep to that? I mean, obviously her first step is reaching out to you, and we'll have all your contact information in the show notes. But how should she think about that as she's reaching out to you?
So I think about, one, how brave it is. It is really brave to say, I need some help, especially as Indian physicians, because they're so busy taking care of everybody else, right? So just kind of knowing that, one, this is incredibly brave of you. Two, I want a better quality of life. That is one aspect of it. And I will say to some of my folks when I work with them, if your life is feeling noisy, I don't know that I can completely get rid of the noise, but I can help you make it less noisy.
I would imagine this is a population, and maybe I'm projecting onto this population a little bit, but I would imagine this is a population that loves to overthink, and as a result, potentially thinks to themselves prior to reaching out to you, well, now's not the right time. I've got this going on. Now's not coming into this holiday, or it's this person's birthday, or I've got this rotation, or whatever physicians do. Like, there's this surgery coming up, not the right time. You and I have talked offline, and I know one of the things you have done very well, at least it seems to me. I'm not the client, but it seems to me like you've done a very good job of making that initial reach out very easy, so that they don't have to wait for the right time, because that initial conversation is very simple. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. So I believe in carefrontation, not confrontation, right? So I might ask them a question like, so if one of your patients was reluctant to reach out, what are some things that you would want them to think about?
I think when you frame it from that perspective, we all go a little bit more like, oh yeah, we weren't doing this for ourselves. As we sort of, is there anything that you'd want people to take away?
I think that invest in yourself, because if you don't, nobody else will.
It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It is nothing short of a gift that you've given me this time, because of how busy you are and how much you help other people. For those watching this, we're recording this on a Saturday because she didn't have time any other place. So I feel incredibly lucky and want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And I'm sure therapists will have gotten a lot out of this. And obviously, if you are, struggling female Indian doctor, obviously reach out to Kavita. She's amazing, and she will start that conversation, and you'll be grateful. I'm going to put all of your information in the show notes, but is there any place where they can reach out to you, or, is there any preferred way that you have them to reach out to you?
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Sean. It was a pleasure to spend time with you. The best way folks can reach out to me is my website. It's drkavita.com. It's DOCTOR, Kavita.com, where people can learn a little bit more about me and also be able to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hope everybody enjoyed this. Leave some comment and let us know how we did. And Kavita, I can't wait to talk with you more in the future.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to that slice of pizza sometime.
Yes, the Giordano's.
Thank you.